Around 4,200 years ago, something happened to the climate. Something big. Something that didn't care about empires or armies, or how advanced your civilization thought it was. 3 major civilizations collapsed, not one after another. At the same time, within decades of each other, thousands of miles apart. The old kingdom of Egypt fell. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia vanished. The Indus Valley Civilization started its slow fade into history. These weren't small societies. These were the superpowers of the Bronze Age, and they all went down together. Here's what makes this strange. These civilizations didn't know each other existed. Egypt and Akkad had some contact through trade. But the Indus Valley, they were doing their own thing, completely separate. No shared borders, no common enemies, no wars between them. Yet they all collapsed around 2200 BCE. Give or take a few decades. Scientists call it the 4.2 Kiloyear event. That's 4,200 years before 1950, which is how climate scientists measure time. It shows up in ice cores from Greenland, in cave formations from China, in ocean sediments from the Gulf of Oman. The evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Something changed in the atmosphere. The monsoons failed. Rainfall patterns shifted. Rivers dried up or changed course. And the civilizations that depended on predictable water, they couldn't adapt fast enough. Think about what that means. These weren't primitive societies. Egypt had been building pyramids for 1,000 years. The Akkadians had created the world's first empire. The Indus Valley had cities with indoor plumbing and standardized weights and measures. They were sophisticated. They were organized. They had systems. And it wasn't enough. The collapse took different forms in different places. In Egypt, the central government fractured. Local governors became warlords. The country split into competing kingdoms. Famine spread. People abandoned the cities and moved north, following the Nile toward any water they could find. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire just disappeared. One generation, they controlled everything from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The next generation, the cities were empty, people scattered. The empire's capital, Akkad, was abandoned so completely that archaeologists still haven't found it. The Indus Valley Civilization had a slower death. Their cities didn't burn, they just emptied out over generations. People drifted away, the writing system was forgotten, the trade networks dissolved. By 1900 BCE, the great cities were ghost towns. What's fascinating is that we can see this collapse coming in the archaeological record. Food storage increases, people start hoarding grain, city walls get reinforced, there's evidence of migration, of people moving, searching for better land. They knew something was wrong. They tried to prepare. It didn't matter. This isn't ancient history in the way we usually think about it. This is a story about what happens when the climate changes faster than societies can adapt, when the systems that feed millions of people suddenly stop working, when the rains don't come and the rivers run dry. And here's the thing that should keep us up at night. These civilizations had centuries of stability before the collapse, generations of predictable weather, reliable harvests. Then it changed. Fast. We need to understand what happened to them, because we're not so different. Our civilizations depend on predictable climate too, stable rainfall, consistent growing seasons, rivers that flow where we expect them to flow. What happens when that changes? Before the collapse, these 3 civilizations were thriving, not just surviving, thriving. Let's start with Egypt. The Old Kingdom was at its peak. This was the age of pyramid builders, the age when pharaohs commanded armies of workers and resources flowed into monuments that still stand today. The 4th dynasty built the Great Pyramid around 2560 BCE. That's 350 years before the collapse. Think about that timeline. 3.5 centuries of stability. Enough time for the pyramid builders to become a distant memory. Enough time for their grandchildren's grandchildren to take that stability for granted. The Nile flooded every year like clockwork. The floods brought fresh soil from upstream, rich black silt that made the valley fertile. Farmers planted wheat and barley in that soil. The harvest fed millions. The surplus went to the pharaoh's storehouses. That surplus paid for everything: the temples, the pyramids, the bureaucracy, the army. Egypt's population peaked around 2.5 million people during the Old Kingdom. That's massive for the ancient world. Most of them lived along a narrow strip of land beside the Nile. The river was everything: water for drinking, water for crops, fish for protein, papyrus for writing, transport for trade. The government controlled it all. Local governors called nomarchs managed each region. They collected taxes, organized labor, maintained irrigation canals, reported to the pharaoh in Memphis. The system worked because the floods were predictable. Year after year, generation after generation. Now look at Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire was something new in human history, the world's first empire. Before Akkad, you had city-states, independent cities that fought each other constantly. Ur, Uruk, Lagash, each one ruled by its own king. Sargon of Akkad changed that around 2334 BCE. He conquered the city-states one by one, united them under his rule, created an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, over 1,000 miles of territory. The capital city of Akkad sat somewhere in central Mesopotamia, probably near modern Baghdad. We're not sure exactly where because the city vanished so completely, but in its prime, Akkad was the centre of the world. Trade routes converged there: grain from the south, timber from the north, copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The Akkadians inherited something crucial from the Sumerians who came before them: irrigation technology. Mesopotamia means between the rivers in Greek, the Tigris and Euphrates. But unlike the Nile, these rivers were unpredictable. They flooded at the wrong times, changed course without warning, destroyed crops as often as they watered them. So the Sumerians built canals, elaborate networks that captured floodwater and directed it to the fields. The Akkadians expanded these systems, made them bigger, more complex. They could farm land that would otherwise be desert. The population of the Akkadian Empire probably reached 800,000 people, maybe more, most of them farmers, growing barley mostly, some wheat, dates from palm trees. They raised sheep and goats. The animals grazed on whatever grew between the irrigated fields. The system was fragile, though, more fragile than Egypt's. The canals needed constant maintenance. Silt built up. Channels collapsed. Salt accumulated in the soil from evaporation. If the maintenance stopped, the whole system could fail within a generation. But it worked. For 140 years, the Akkadian Empire dominated the region. Sargon ruled for 56 years. His grandson Naram-Sin ruled for another 36. Long reigns, stable reigns, the kind of stability that makes people forget how fragile everything is. Now the Indus Valley. This civilization is the most mysterious of the three. We can read Egyptian hieroglyphs, we can read Akkadian cuneiform, but Indus script, still undeciphered. We have thousands of seals with writing on them, short inscriptions, maybe names, maybe titles. Nobody knows for sure. What we do know comes from archaeology, and what the archaeology shows is remarkable. The Indus Valley Civilization covered more territory than Egypt and Akkad combined, over 380,000 square miles, from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, hundreds of settlements, 5 major cities. The 2 biggest were Harappa in the north and Mohenjo-Daro in the south. These cities were planned, not like the organic growth of Mesopotamian cities. The streets formed grids. Buildings followed standard sizes. They used standardized bricks, same proportions everywhere, 4 to 2 to 1 ratio, length to width to height. The cities had drainage systems, covered drains along every major street, private bathrooms in houses connected to the public drains. Some homes had wells. This is 2500 BCE. Most of the world was still dumping waste in the street. Mohenjo-Daro had a population around 40,000 at its peak. Harappa was similar. The total population of the Indus Valley Civilization probably reached 5 million people. That's twice the population of Egypt, spread across a much larger area. They grew wheat and barley. Cotton too. They were the first civilization to cultivate cotton on a large scale. They raised cattle and water buffalo. Chickens. The Indus River flooded annually like the Nile. Predictable floods. Rich soil. Good. Harvests. Trade was crucial. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian goods show up in Indus sites. They traded by sea. Ships sailed from the Indus Delta to the Persian Gulf, up to the cities of Sumer and Akkad. The voyage took weeks, maybe months, but the profits were worth it. Here's what's interesting about all three civilizations. They were at different stages of development. Egypt was old. The Pyramid Age was already ancient history by 2200 BCE. The Akkadian Empire was young, still in its first century. The Indus Valley was mature, stable. Their cities had been standing for 700 years. But they all depended on the same thing. Water, predictable water, annual floods that came at the right time, rivers that flowed where they were supposed to flow, rainfall that fell when crops needed it. Each civilization had adapted to its environment over centuries. Egypt learned to work with the Nile. Mesopotamia learned to control the Tigris and Euphrates. The Indus Valley learned to harness their rivers' floods. The adaptations were different, but the principle was the same. Predict the water, control the water, distribute the water, feed the people, collect the surplus, build the state. The systems were sophisticated. In Egypt, nilometers measured the height of the annual flood. Officials used these measurements to predict harvest size, to set tax rates, to plan distributions from storage. In Mesopotamia, water management was a full-time job. Teams of workers maintained the canals, cleared silt, repaired breaches. The government kept records of every canal. Who was responsible for each section? What repairs were needed? When they were completed? The Indus Valley Civilization left fewer records, but the archaeology tells the story. Their drainage systems required constant maintenance. Their wells needed to be cleaned. Their granaries needed to be managed. All of it depended on having enough water to grow enough food to feed enough workers to maintain the systems. Population density was high in all three places. Egypt's population was concentrated in a narrow band along the Nile. The Akkadian heartland supported hundreds of thousands in a relatively small area. The Indus cities were smaller individually, but there were hundreds of them. High population density means vulnerability. You can't just move when times get hard. Where would you go? The desert, the mountains, the ocean. The only habitable land was already inhabited, already farmed, already claimed. These civilizations had pushed their environments to the limit. Every acre of farmable land was being farmed. Every drop of available water was being used. There was no buffer, no reserve capacity, no room for error. And they'd been doing this for so long that it seemed normal, permanent, the way things would always be. Egypt had been stable for 800 years. The Akkadian Empire had known nothing but success. The Indus Valley had been thriving for 7 centuries, Multiple generations had lived and died, never knowing anything different. That's the world that was about to change. 3 civilizations, millions of people, centuries of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure and social organization. All of it built on the assumption that the climate would stay the same. It didn't. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating. All drifting off to the same ancient mysteries together. There's something calming about these old catastrophes. They happened so long ago. Everyone involved has been dust for 4,000 years. Their crises aren't our crises. Their fears aren't our fears. But their resilience? That's ours too. We're here because they survived. Because humans always find a way through. So let these civilizations collapse in your mind. Let the details blur. The dates don't matter now. Just the rhythm of history. Rising and falling like breath. The Akkadian Empire didn't just fade away. It shattered. Fast. Within a generation, maybe 2, the world's first multi-ethnic empire went from controlling everything between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf to nothing. Cities abandoned, trade routes empty. The imperial administration just gone. Here's what makes this collapse different from Egypt's slow decline. The Akkadians left records. Clay tablets baked hard by time, and some of those tablets tell us exactly what was happening. They're not pretty. One tablet from the city of Umma talks about grain prices. Barley cost 60 times what it normally did. 60 times. That's not inflation, that's famine. Another tablet mentions people selling their children. Not as slaves for life, just temporarily. Hoping someone with food would keep them alive until things got better. Things didn't get better. The king during the final years was Shakali-Shari. His name means King of all Kings. But his letters don't sound royal. They sound desperate. He's writing to governors about food supplies, about maintaining order, about holding the empire together. You can feel the panic in the administrative language, the careful bureaucratic phrases cracking under pressure. Then the letters stop. Shakali-Shari disappears from the record around 2193 BCE. We don't know how he died. The tablets just stop mentioning him. After that, chaos, multiple kings claiming the throne, civil war. And then the Akkadian language itself starts to fade from official documents. Sumerian comes back. The old language, the language from before the empire. Archaeological evidence shows what happened to the cities. Tel Leilan in modern Syria was a major Akkadian centre. Around 2200 BCE, people left, not gradually, quickly. They abandoned their homes with stuff still inside, pottery, tools, things you'd take if you had time to pack. They didn't have time, or maybe they thought they'd come back. They never did. The site stayed empty for 300 years, 3 centuries of silence. When people finally resettled Tel Leilan, they were different people, different culture. The Akkadians were gone. Other cities show the same pattern. Bray, Mosan, Chaga Bazar, all abandoned around the same time, all in the same region. Northern Mesopotamia, the area that had been the empire's breadbasket, the fertile zone where rain fell reliably and crops grew without irrigation. That rain stopped. Soil samples from the region show something stark. Around 2200 BCE, the dust levels spike, not a little, dramatically. The kind of dust that comes from dried up soil, from fields turning to powder, from wind blowing across land that used to be farmland. Scientists call it aridification, a dry spell. But that makes it sound temporary. This lasted centuries. The rain pattern shifted. The storms that used to water northern Mesopotamia went somewhere else, maybe north into Anatolia, maybe they just dispersed. Either way, the fields dried up. Here's what that meant in practical terms. The Akkadian Empire had two agricultural zones. The south, around Babylon and Ur, used irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates. Those rivers still flowed. The water came from snowmelt in the mountains far to the north. A drought in Mesopotamia didn't stop that snow from falling in Armenia. But the north depended on rain, direct rainfall on the fields, and when that rain stopped, those fields died. No amount of engineering could fix it. You can't irrigate land that's 200 miles from the nearest river, not with Bronze Age technology. The north had been crucial. It produced the surplus grain that fed the empire's armies, the excess that let kings build monuments and pay bureaucrats and maintain roads. When the north failed, the whole system collapsed. Southern Mesopotamia survived. The irrigation kept working. Cities like Ur and Uruk kept going. But they were just cities again. Not imperial centres, not capitals of anything except themselves. The empire was dead. We have one text from this period that's haunting. It's called The Curse of Akkad. It's a poem written maybe a century after the collapse. It describes the fall of the empire as divine punishment, the gods angry at human arrogance, standard Bronze Age theology. But between the religious language there are details, real details. The poem talks about grain that doesn't grow, about fish that disappear from the marshes, about the countryside becoming hostile. It describes refugees flooding into the cities, people from the north, desperate, looking for food. The cities can't feed them, can't even feed their own people. There's a line that translates roughly as the wide sea no longer rose in flood. The Persian Gulf, its water levels dropped. That's not poetic license, that's observation. When rainfall decreases across a whole region, sea levels in enclosed gulfs drop too. Less water flowing in from rivers, more evaporation. The person who wrote this poem saw it happen. The Curse of Akkad blames King Naram-Sin for the disaster. It says he attacked the temple of Enlil, the storm god. That Enlil responded by withdrawing rain from the land. The Akkadians understood cause and effect. They just got the cause wrong. It wasn't a king's sacrilege, it was climate shift. But the effect, they described that perfectly. Some scholars think the collapse happened even faster than the evidence suggests, that we're seeing the end result, but the actual breaking point was sudden. Maybe one or two catastrophic harvest failures, the kind where nothing grows, where the seeds die in the ground. After the first bad year, people would have eaten their stored grain. After the second, they'd have eaten their seed grain, the stuff they were supposed to plant next year. After the third, there was nothing left. That's when cities empty out, when empires fall. The Akkadian language survived. Sort of. It evolved into Babylonian and Assyrian. Those languages lasted for thousands more years. But the Akkadian identity, the sense of being one empire, one people, that died with Shah-Kali-Shari. The political unity never came back. Later Mesopotamian kings remembered the Akkadian Empire. They called themselves kings of Akkad even when Akkad was just ruins. It became mythical. The Golden Age, the time when everything worked, when one king ruled everything and the gods smiled on humanity. But they also remembered the collapse. Every Mesopotamian king after 2200 BCE knew that empires could fall, that the rain could stop, that everything could end. It made them careful, made them maintain grain reserves, made them watch the weather. There's something almost modern about how the Akkadian Empire ended. Not through conquest, not through revolution, through environmental change that made their economic system impossible. The infrastructure was fine, the roads still existed, the city still stood. But the surplus was gone. And without surplus, you can't have an empire. You need extra food to feed soldiers, extra resources to pay administrators, extra everything to maintain control over distant territories. When the north dried up, that extra disappeared. The empire didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because the foundation it was built on vanished. The Akkadians couldn't have prevented this. They didn't understand climate systems, didn't know that rainfall patterns could shift for centuries, didn't have the technology to adapt. They just watched their world end and tried to explain it with the tools they had. Gods, curses, divine anger. We know better now. We can read ice cores and soil samples. We can track ancient climate patterns. We know the 4.2 Kiloyear event was real, a genuine shift in global weather patterns. But knowing doesn't make the human cost less real, doesn't bring back the people who starved, doesn't rebuild the cities that emptied. The Akkadian collapse was the first domino, the most dramatic, the fastest. Egypt's fall would be slower, more gradual. The Indus Valley's decline would take centuries, but all three civilizations were responding to the same thing: climate change they couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't survive. And here's what keeps me thinking about this. The Akkadians were advanced, sophisticated. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy. They tracked the stars and predicted eclipses. But they couldn't predict rain, couldn't control it, couldn't adapt fast enough when it stopped. All that knowledge, all that power, and they fell anyway. Not because they were primitive, because they were human, because some things are bigger than empires, bigger than kings, bigger than all our clever solutions. The clay tablets from those final years are still readable, still sitting in museums, still telling us about grain prices and desperate letters and children sold for food. The Akkadians are gone, but their last words remain, baked hard, preserved by the same drought that killed them. Egypt's collapse looked different, slower, more like bleeding out than a sudden wound. The old kingdom didn't just stop, it fractured. The central government weakened, provincial governors gained power, they stopped sending taxes to the capital, stopped following orders from Memphis, started acting like independent kings in their own territories. We can track this in the tombs. Early Old Kingdom tombs cluster around the pyramids, near the pharaoh. That's where the elite wanted to be buried, close to divine power, but later tombs spread out. They're in the provinces, local governors building monuments in their own districts, not asking permission, not seeking approval from Memphis. The titles change too. Early inscriptions call officials servant of the pharaoh. Later ones drop that. They just list the person's own achievements, their own power. The pharaoh becomes irrelevant, just a distant figure in a failing capital. Around 2181 BCE, the Sixth Dynasty ended. The last strong pharaoh was Pepi II. He supposedly ruled for 94 years. That's probably exaggerated. Ancient king lists inflate numbers, but he definitely ruled a long time, long enough to watch everything fall apart. After Pepi II died, chaos. The 7th and 8th dynasties were a mess. Multiple kings claiming the throne, some ruled for months, some for weeks. The king lists from this period contradict each other. Nobody knew who was actually in charge. Then came the first intermediate period. That's what historians call it. Intermediate is a polite word for collapse. For 2 centuries of fragmentation and civil war. Here's what happened to ordinary people. We have texts from this period. They're called lamentations. Poetry, basically. But dark poetry. Descriptions of a world turned upside down. One text says the Nile turned to blood. That's probably not literal. Probably describes the river running low, exposing red sediment, or maybe algae blooms in stagnant water. Either way, it meant the floods were failing. Another text talks about the poor wearing fine linen while the rich go hungry. That's social chaos, the old order breaking down. When food becomes scarce, wealth stops meaning what it used to mean. You can't eat gold, can't drink from fancy pottery. There's a text called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It describes Egypt in crisis, tombs being robbed, the dead disrespected, foreigners entering the delta, the desert encroaching on farmland. That last detail matters, desert encroaching. That's not metaphor, that's observation. The Nile floods were failing, not completely, not every year, but often enough, irregularly enough. The river would rise some years, stay low others. Farmers couldn't predict it, couldn't plan. That unpredictability might have been worse than consistent drought. At least with consistent drought you adapt, you change crops, move to areas with better water. But when the floods are random, some years good, some terrible, you can't adapt, you just gamble, plant and hope. Nilometers tracked the flood levels. These were measuring stations along the river, marked stones showing how high the water rose each year. We have records from later periods. They show the ideal flood level. Too low, not enough water for crops. Too high, it washes away villages. During the first intermediate period, those measurements would have been all over the place, wildly variable. Some years barely any flood. Other years maybe normal, never reliable. The Egyptian economy depended on that reliability. The whole tax system was based on predictable harvests. The pharaoh's officials would assess each farm based on the flood level. Higher flood meant more fertile land meant higher taxes. It was mathematical, precise. It required consistency. When the floods became unpredictable, that system broke. Some years the government would expect taxes based on normal floods. But the floods didn't come. Farmers couldn't pay. The government couldn't collect. Revenue dried up faster than the fields. Without revenue, the pharaoh couldn't pay the army, couldn't maintain the bureaucracy, couldn't fund building projects that employed thousands. The whole centralized system depended on surplus. When surplus disappeared, centralization became impossible. Provincial governors saw this happening. They had local resources, local grain stores, local loyalty. They could survive independently. Why send food to Memphis when Memphis had nothing to offer in return? Why obey a pharaoh who couldn't protect you or feed you? So Egypt split, not into two kingdoms, into dozens of small territories, each governor ruling their own nome. Some called themselves kings, others just stopped pretending there was any central authority. The desert did encroach. We can see it in the archaeological record. Settlements that had been thriving farming communities were abandoned, sand covered. Them. The fertile zone along the Nile shrank. People crowded into areas that still flooded reliably. That crowding created conflict, competition for good land, for water access, for resources. The texts from this period mention warfare between nomes, local conflicts, not grand imperial battles, just desperate fights over survival. Some areas did better than others. Upper Egypt, the south, seems to have maintained more stability. The Nile is narrower there, more predictable. Even reduced floods still watered the valley. Lower Egypt, the delta, suffered more. The delta depended on massive floods spreading water across flat land. When floods weakened, the delta dried faster. We have evidence of population movement, people migrating south, away from the delta, toward areas with more reliable water. That migration shows up in burial practices, in pottery styles, in the mixing of regional traditions that had been distinct for centuries. The first intermediate period wasn't completely dark. Art continued, literature continued. Some of Egypt's greatest wisdom texts were written during this time, but they're different from Old Kingdom texts. less confident, more questioning. They ask why the gods allowed this to happen, why Maat, the cosmic order, had failed. One text has a man debating with his soul about suicide, whether life in this broken world is worth living. His soul argues for endurance, for hope. But the fact that this text exists tells you how bad things got, how desperate people felt. Around 2055 BCE, reunification began. A dynasty from Thebes in the south conquered the other nomes, established the Middle Kingdom. Egypt was whole again, but it was different, more cautious. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs maintained huge grain reserves, built fortresses. They remembered the collapse, made sure it couldn't happen again. The Middle Kingdom also shows innovation. New irrigation techniques, better water management. They built canals to capture floodwater, store it for dry years. They adapted, learned from the crisis. But here's what's interesting. The climate didn't really improve. The Nile flood stayed somewhat unpredictable for centuries. What changed was human response. Egypt developed systems to handle variability, to survive irregular floods. The Old Kingdom couldn't do that. It was built for consistency. When consistency ended, it fell. The Middle Kingdom was built for uncertainty, for bad years and good years, for survival rather than glory. It lasted 500 years, not as long as the Old Kingdom. But through worse conditions, Egypt's collapse was slower than Akkad's, more gradual, but in some ways harder. The Akkadians faced sudden, catastrophic drought. It was over quickly, brutal but brief. Egypt faced centuries of instability, generations born into chaos, growing up never knowing stability. That's a different kind of trauma. The texts from the first intermediate period talk about remembering better times, about how grandparents spoke of the old days when the Nile flooded properly, when pharaohs built pyramids, when Egypt was united and strong. That nostalgia runs through everything, the sense of loss, of having fallen from grace. But they also talk about endurance, about surviving, about maintaining dignity in hard times. There's a text that sees something like, "A man's character is tested in difficulty, not comfort." The first intermediate period tested Egypt's character. The fact that Egypt reunified shows they passed that test. The population dropped during these centuries. We can estimate from settlement patterns, from the number of occupied sites, maybe 20% fewer people by the end. Some died from famine, others from conflict, some just didn't have children. When the future looks dark, people stop reproducing. But Egypt survived. The language survived. The culture survived. The religion survived. Even the idea of pharaonic rule survived. When Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt, he didn't invent something new. He restored something old. The concept of a unified Egypt under one divine king. That idea had survived 2 centuries of fragmentation. That's remarkable. Most cultures that fragment like that don't come back together. They split permanently, become different peoples, different nations. But Egypt maintained its identity through the chaos, kept believing it should be one kingdom. That belief eventually made reunification possible. The climate shift that caused this, it lasted longer than the collapse. The reduced Nile floods continued for centuries, but Egypt adapted, built infrastructure to handle it, developed agriculture that worked with less water, changed their economic system to function without massive surplus. In a way, the collapse made Egypt stronger, more resilient. The Old Kingdom had been rigid, perfect for perfect conditions. The Middle Kingdom was flexible, built to bend without breaking. That flexibility came from trauma, from learning the hard way that nothing lasts forever, that even the Nile can fail. The Indus Valley collapse is the strangest of the 3, because we can't hear them explain what happened. They had writing. We found thousands of inscribed seals, but nobody can read it. The script remains undeciphered, so we're watching a civilization die in complete silence. The Indus Valley Civilization covered more territory than Egypt or Akkad, stretched across what's now Pakistan and northwest India. Over 1 million square kilometres, hundreds of settlements, maybe 5 million people at its peak. That's huge for the Bronze Age, and they were organised. Incredibly organised. Their cities show planning that makes other Bronze Age settlements look chaotic. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira. These weren't organic growths. They were designed. Grid layouts, straight streets, standardised brick sizes. Every brick in every building was the same ratio, 4:2:1, length to width to height, across the entire civilization for centuries. They had drainage systems, covered sewers running under the streets, wastewater flowing away from homes. Some houses had bathrooms with sitting toilets. This is 2500 BCE. Most of the world was still throwing waste out windows. The cities had granaries, massive storage facilities, citadels on raised platforms, public baths. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro is 12 metres long, 7 metres wide, waterproofed with bitumen, steps leading down into it, probably used for ritual bathing, maybe religious ceremonies. They traded far. Indus seals show up in Mesopotamia, in Akkadian cities. Mesopotamian texts mention a place called Meluha. That's probably the Indus region. They traded carnelian beads, timber, cotton textiles, copper. The Indus people knew about Mesopotamia, had commercial relationships with them. But here's what's weird. The Indus cities show almost no signs of warfare. No massive walls, no weapon stockpiles, no evidence of armies. Some fortifications, sure, but nothing like what you see in Mesopotamia or Egypt. No palaces, no temples we can identify, no obvious kings or priests. The art is different too. Mesopotamian art shows kings, gods, battles, conquests. Egyptian art is all about pharaohs and the afterlife. Indus art, small figurines, seals with animals, geometric patterns, no grand monuments to rulers, no propaganda. It's like they organise themselves differently, maybe more collective, maybe merchant councils instead of kings, maybe religious authority we don't recognise, we don't know. The silence of their script keeps us guessing. Around 1900 BCE, it started changing. The cities didn't collapse suddenly. They declined, slowly, over generations. The careful planning stopped. New construction got sloppy. Buildings weren't maintained. Streets weren't cleaned. The drainage systems clogged. Trash piled up. People started leaving. Not all at once. Gradually. The population of Mohenjo-daro dropped. Harappa shrank. Some smaller settlements were abandoned completely. The people moved, mostly east and south, toward the Ganges Valley, away from the Indus River system. The writing disappeared. The standardized weights stopped being used. The long-distance trade networks broke down. The seals stopped showing up in Mesopotamia. The whole integrated system just unwound. But there's no evidence of conquest, no burned cities, no mass graves, no weapons scattered in the streets. This wasn't invasion. This wasn't war. This was people choosing to leave. Why? The climate. Same as Egypt and Akkad. The monsoons shifted. The monsoons are everything in South Asia. They bring rain from the ocean, drench the land, fill the rivers. The Indus civilization depended on monsoon rains, on predictable flooding, on water. Around 2200 BCE, the monsoons weakened. We can see this in cave formations. Stalagmites in caves preserve climate records. The oxygen isotopes in the minerals tell us about rainfall. The data shows the monsoons got weaker, more erratic, less reliable. The rivers changed. The Indus has always been unpredictable, but other rivers dried up completely. There was a river called the Sarasvati, or Gagahakra. It shows up in ancient texts. Archaeological surveys show where it used to flow, a major river system. Many Indus settlements were along its banks. That river dried up, probably around 2000 BCE climate shift. Tectonic changes, maybe. The headwaters got diverted. The river became seasonal, then just a dry channel. All those settlements along it, suddenly without water. The people adapted at first. They dug wells, deeper wells than before. We can see this in the archaeology. Wells that go down 10-15 meters. That's hard work, dangerous work. You don't dig wells that deep unless you're desperate. They changed crops. Early Indus agriculture focused on wheat and barley. Later they switched to more drought-resistant crops. Millet. Rice in some areas, trying to work with less water. But it wasn't enough. The whole system was built for abundance, for reliable water, for trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. When water became scarce, that system couldn't function. Towns that depended on trade couldn't survive. Merchants couldn't move goods without water for their animals, without rivers for boats. The cities required surplus to maintain. The drainage systems needed maintenance. The public buildings needed upkeep. The standardized production needed resources. When surplus disappeared, so did the infrastructure. People moved to where water was more reliable, smaller settlements, villages, places that could survive on local resources. The urbanization reversed. The Bronze Age gave way to something simpler, more scattered, less connected. The interesting thing, the people survived. The Indus civilization vanished, but the people didn't. They became the ancestors of the later Indian cultures. The knowledge didn't completely disappear. Some technologies continued. Some cultural practices persisted. But the cities, the writing, the integrated trade networks, gone. By 1300 BCE, the major Indus cities were abandoned. Mohenjo-daro was empty. Harappa was a shadow. The civilization that had lasted 700 years just faded away. No dramatic end, no final battle, just a slow dissolution into smaller, simpler communities. The silence makes it haunting. We can read Akkadian laments about drought. We can read Egyptian texts about chaos. But the Indus people left no explanation. Their seals just stop. Their cities just empty. We're left guessing. Some scholars think the script wasn't even language. Maybe just symbols, accounting marks, religious icons. If that's true, they never wrote down their thoughts, never recorded their history, never explained themselves to the future. Others think it is language, complex language. But the texts are too short to decipher. The longest inscription is maybe 26 symbols. That's not enough. You need longer texts, bilingual texts, something to give you a key. The Rosetta Stone worked because it had the same text in 3 languages. The Indus script has no such key, so we watch them through archaeology alone, through what they built, what they left behind. The bones tell us they were healthy, well-nourished, no signs of widespread violence. The cities tell us they were organized, sophisticated, peaceful maybe, but when the climate shifted, they couldn't maintain it. The organization required resources, required surplus, required water. When those things became uncertain, the whole structure became impossible. The people who left the cities didn't disappear. They just lived differently. Smaller groups, local agriculture, less specialization, less trade, less complexity. In some ways, maybe easier lives. No massive public works to maintain, no long-distance trade to manage. Just farming, just survival. But they lost things too. The writing, the standardized measurements, the architectural knowledge, the urban planning. Those skills need cities to practice, need institutions to preserve, need writing to pass down. When the cities emptied, those skills went with them. It took 1,000 years for urbanization to return to the region. 1,000 years before cities rose again in the Ganges Valley. By then it was different culture, different language, different religion. The Indus civilization had become a ghost, buried under time. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, same. Decades. Egypt fragmented but survived. Akkad shattered and reformed under new rulers. The Indus Valley just dissolved. 3 different responses to the same climate crisis. What connects them? Water. All 3 depended on rivers, on predictable flooding, on agricultural surplus from irrigated land. When the water became unreliable, their foundations cracked. But here's what's fascinating. The crisis was the same. The responses were different. Egypt eventually reunified, built infrastructure to handle variable floods, learned to survive uncertainty. Akkad got conquered, but Mesopotamian civilization continued. New empires rose, new cities. The Indus Valley? It just let go, walked away from cities entirely, chose simplicity over complexity. Maybe that was wisdom. Maybe maintaining cities during drought was impossible. Maybe the Indus people saw that first, accepted it, moved on, while Egypt and Mesopotamia clung to urban life, fighting to preserve it. The Indus Valley just adapted, became something else. We'll never know their reasoning. The silence preserves the mystery, but their choice worked. The people survived, their descendants thrived. The cities died, but the culture lived, just in different forms, quieter forms, forms that didn't need writing or monuments or grand public works. Sometimes survival means letting go, accepting that what worked before won't work now. The Indus people might have understood that better than anyone. They built magnificent cities, then left them behind when the world changed. No drama, no last stand, just acceptance. So what actually caused all this? 3 civilizations, 3 continents, same time frame. What's the connection? Climate, specifically a megadrought. The technical term is the 4.2 Kiloyear event. Scientists named it after when it happened. 4,200 years ago, around 2,200 BCE. Give or take a few decades. This wasn't a normal drought. Normal droughts last a few years, maybe a decade if you're unlucky. This one lasted centuries. In some places, 300 years. That's 12 generations. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren would still be dealing with it. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Ice cores from glaciers, sediment cores from lake beds, cave formations called speleothems, tree rings, ocean sediments. All of them tell the same story. The climate shifted, fast, and stayed shifted for a very long time. Here's how we know. Ice cores work like frozen time capsules. Scientists drill down through glaciers. Each layer represents 1 year of snowfall. The ice traps tiny air bubbles. Those bubbles preserve the atmosphere from that year. The oxygen isotopes in the ice tell us about temperature and precipitation. Ice cores from Kilimanjaro in Africa show the shift. So do cores from the Himalayas. Around 2,200 BCE, the ratios change. Less precipitation, cooler temperatures in some regions, warmer in others. The patterns shift. Lake sediments tell a similar story. When lakes have water, organic material accumulates on the bottom. Plants, algae, dead organisms. When lakes dry up, wind blows in dust and sand. Different material, different colour, different chemistry. You can see the layers when you drill a core. Lake Van in Turkey has sediment cores going back thousands of years. Around 2200 BCE, the organic layers thin out. Dust layers thicken. The lake was shrinking. Less rain feeding it. More evaporation. The same pattern shows up in lakes across the Middle East and Mediterranean. Speleothems are even better. These are formations in caves. Stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Stalagmites growing from the floor. They form when water drips through limestone. The water carries dissolved minerals. Those minerals deposit, layer by layer, year by year. The oxygen isotopes in speleothems tell us about rainfall. Heavy oxygen versus light oxygen. The ratio depends on how much it rained, how strong the monsoons were, how much moisture was in the air. Scientists can measure these ratios with incredible precision. Caves in Israel show the 4.2 Kiloyear event clearly. The Sorek cave has speleothems that preserve 25,000 years of climate history. Around 2200 BCE, the isotope ratios shift dramatically. They stay shifted for about 300 years, then gradually return to normal. The same pattern appears in caves across the region: Iran, Iraq, Syria, all showing reduced rainfall starting around 2200 BCE. Not just less rain, much less rain. Some estimates suggest 20 to 30% reduction. That's catastrophic for agriculture. Tree rings add more detail. Trees grow wider rings in good years, narrow rings in bad years. You can count back through the rings, date them precisely, see which years were wet and which were dry. Ancient trees from the Mediterranean region show stress patterns, narrow rings clustering around 2200 BCE, years of poor growth, not just 1 or 2 bad years, decades of them. The trees were struggling, not enough water, not enough nutrients. Ocean sediments complete the picture. Rivers carry sediment to the ocean. When rivers flow strong, they carry more material, more organic matter. When rivers weaken, less material reaches the ocean. The sediment layers in the ocean floor preserve this. Cores from the Gulf of Oman show changes around 2200 BCE. Less riverborne material. The rivers feeding the Gulf were weaker. The Tigris and Euphrates carried less water. The Indus contributed less sediment. The whole region was drying out. But why? What caused the climate to shift so dramatically? The honest answer is we're not completely sure. Climate is complicated. Multiple factors interact. But scientists have theories. Good theories backed by evidence. The main suspect is the North Atlantic Oscillation. This is a climate pattern that affects the Northern Hemisphere. It involves atmospheric pressure differences between Iceland and the Azores. When the pressure difference is strong, it affects wind patterns, storm tracks, where rain falls. The NAO shifts between positive and negative phases. Positive phases bring wet winters to northern Europe. Negative phases bring dry conditions to the Mediterranean and Middle East. Around 2200 BCE, the NAO appears to have shifted to a strongly negative phase and stayed there. This would explain the drought in the Middle East, in North Africa. The storm track shifted north. Rain that normally fell on Egypt and Mesopotamia fell elsewhere, or didn't fall at all. The atmosphere reorganized itself. The monsoons matter too. South Asian climate depends on monsoon rains. These are seasonal winds that bring moisture from the ocean. They're driven by temperature differences between land and sea. When the land heats up in summer, air rises. That draws in moist air from the ocean. That moisture becomes rain. But monsoons are sensitive to subtle changes. Ocean temperatures, atmospheric circulation, the position of the jet stream. Around 2200 BCE, something shifted the monsoon pattern. The rains weakened, became less reliable. The Indus civilization depended on those rains. When they failed, everything failed. Solar activity might have played a role. The sun's output isn't constant. It varies slightly over time. Periods of reduced solar activity can affect climate. There's evidence of reduced solar activity around 2200 BCE. Not huge changes, but enough to influence atmospheric circulation. Volcanic eruptions could have contributed. Large eruptions inject particles into the stratosphere. Those particles reflect sunlight. Cool the planet temporarily. We don't have evidence of a massive eruption right at 2200 BCE, but several smaller eruptions in the preceding decades might have had cumulative effects. The key thing is these factors probably combined. Multiple changes happening together, reinforcing each other, creating a perfect storm of drought conditions that lasted for centuries. Here's what that meant on the ground. Rivers that flooded reliably for thousands of years stopped flooding, or flooded weakly. The Nile's annual flood was everything to Egypt. When it came up short year after year, famine followed. No flood meant no fresh soil. No soil meant poor harvests. Poor harvests meant hunger. The Tigris and Euphrates became less predictable. Some years they flooded too much, other years not enough. Irrigation systems designed for reliable water levels stopped working properly. Canals silted up. Fields went dry. Cities that depended on agricultural surplus found themselves short of food. Rain-fed agriculture collapsed in many areas. The Akkadian Empire controlled territory that relied on rainfall. Northern Mesopotamia, Syria, parts of Iran. Those regions got enough rain to grow crops without irrigation. Usually, but when the rain stopped, the crops failed. Totally. The archaeological evidence is stark. Tel Eilan in Syria was a major city, population around 20,000, prosperous, well organized. Around 2200 BCE it was abandoned. Suddenly, completely. The excavations show a layer of dust, fine wind-blown dust, covering everything. The city sat empty for 300 years. Soil samples from Tel Eilan tell the story. The dust came from dried-up lakes, from exposed riverbeds, from fields that used to grow crops. The land turned to dust. The wind picked it up, buried the empty city. This wasn't just drought. This was desertification. Other cities show similar patterns. Habur Basin in Syria had dozens of settlements. Around 2200 BCE, 75% of them were abandoned. People didn't just leave their homes, they left entire regions. The land couldn't support them anymore. The drought didn't hit everywhere equally. Some areas suffered more than others. The Mediterranean coast stayed relatively wet. Mountains that caught rain stayed green. But the interior regions, the plains, the areas that depended on rivers or seasonal rain, those places became almost uninhabitable. People adapted when they could. They dug deeper wells, changed crops, moved to areas with more reliable water. But adaptation has limits. When the drought lasted decades, then generations, then centuries, even adaptation wasn't enough. The social effects cascaded. Food shortages led to higher prices led to hoarding led to conflict. Conflict disrupted trade. Disrupted trade meant cities couldn't get resources they needed. Cities that specialized in crafts or administration couldn't survive without food from elsewhere. Political systems that depended on surplus collapsed. You can't maintain a bureaucracy during famine, can't support armies, can't build monuments, can't collect taxes from people who have nothing. The complex governmental structures that held these civilizations together simply stopped functioning. Migration intensified everything. People left drought-stricken areas, moved toward water, but the areas with water were already occupied, already using their resources. The influx of climate refugees created competition, conflict. Some regions probably saw violence as groups fought over dwindling resources. The interesting thing is how long it took to recover. The drought ended around 1900 BCE. But the civilizations didn't bounce back immediately. Egypt took another 150 years to reunify. Mesopotamian cities took generations to rebuild. The Indus Valley never really came back, not in the same form. Why the lag? Because once complex systems collapse, they're hard to restart. The knowledge gets lost, the institutions disappear, the trust that held everything together evaporates. You can't just flip a switch and recreate a civilization. Think about all the things that have to work for a Bronze Age empire to function. Farmers need to produce surplus. That surplus needs to get to cities. Cities need craftspeople making goods. Traders need to move those goods. Administrators need to coordinate everything. Soldiers need to protect it all. When drought breaks that chain, reconnecting it takes time. The 4.2 Kiloyear event wasn't unique. Climate shifts happen. But this one hit at a particularly vulnerable time. These civilizations had grown large, specialized, interdependent. They'd optimized for stability, for predictable conditions. When conditions changed, they couldn't adjust fast enough. It's a pattern that repeats through history. Civilizations adapt to their environment, grow to fit it. Then the environment changes, and the very adaptations that made them successful become weaknesses. The irrigation systems that fed millions become useless when rivers dry up. The trade networks that brought wealth become vulnerabilities when they break down. The 4.2 Kiloyear event was global. It affected civilizations in China, in South America, different regions, different cultures, all experiencing climate stress at the same time. This wasn't just a Middle Eastern problem, it was a planetary shift. But the Middle East got hit hardest. The geography made it vulnerable. Narrow river valleys, arid climate, heavy dependence on water sources that came from elsewhere. When those water sources failed, there was nowhere to go, nothing to fall back on. The mega drought eventually ended. The climate stabilized. The rains returned. Rivers flowed again. But the world that emerged was different. New kingdoms, new cultures, new ways of organizing society. The Bronze Age continued, but it had been fundamentally reshaped by those centuries of crisis. Let's dig into how a climate event could get started in the first place. It's easy to picture the world as steady and reliable. Seasons come and go, rivers rise and fall, the planet just ticking along. But that's not quite right. The Earth's climate is more like a giant, complicated machine. Sometimes small changes in one part can set off a chain reaction. Start with the oceans. They cover most of the planet, and they're not just big puddles. They're always moving. Warm water flows from the equator toward the poles. Cold water sinks and slides back toward the equator. These shifting currents, like the Gulf Stream or the Indian Ocean monsoon drift, move heat around the globe. They keep some places warmer and wetter than they'd be otherwise. Now, the atmosphere. Winds blow, storms form, clouds drift for thousands of miles. But the thing is, the air and the ocean are connected. The wind pushes water on the surface. Warm water can change the air above it, making it rise, making it rain, or sometimes making it dry out. Here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes these patterns get stuck. Maybe the ocean cools off in one spot, or the winds in the upper atmosphere get thrown off by a shift in the jet stream. Suddenly the rain that always arrived in June doesn't come, or a region that usually stays dry gets storm after storm. We call these changes climate anomalies. They don't always last long, but every so often something big shifts, and it sticks around for decades or even centuries. So what could actually trigger a long drought like the one 4,200 years ago? There are a few suspects. We'll walk through each. One is ocean circulation, especially in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic Oscillation, the NAO, is like a seesaw of air pressure between two places, Iceland and the Azores. When the pressure is high near the Azores, winds blow one way. When it's high near Iceland, they blow another. This doesn't just affect Europe. It can push storm tracks north or south, changing where the rain falls all the way from Spain to Iran. If the NAO gets stuck in a negative phase, southern Europe and the Middle East dry out, while northern Europe gets drowned in storms. Evidence from ancient pollen, ice and dust shows that such a phase hit around 2200 BCE, and it's stuck around for centuries, not just a few years. But that's only part of the story. Let's talk about the monsoons. Monsoons are seasonal winds, mostly in South and Southeast Asia. In the summer, land heats up faster than the ocean. Hot air rises over land, sucking in moist air from the ocean. That brings rain, sometimes more than a meter in a single season. Whole civilizations depend on it. But monsoons are sensitive. If ocean temperatures shift even a little, the pattern can break. Scientists studying mud from the Arabian Sea found that the summer monsoon weakened sharply around 2200 BCE. The winds weren't as strong. The rain didn't come. Crops failed. What could have caused the monsoon to break down? Some point to changes in the Indian Ocean itself. When there's a lot of warm water near Indonesia and less near Africa, the whole wind system can shift. Modern climate scientists call this the Indian Ocean Dipole. It swings back and forth, sometimes bringing more rain, sometimes less. Was there a bad swing around 2200 BCE? It's hard to say exactly, but some chemical signatures in ancient corals and lake mud suggest the Indian Ocean was acting up. Maybe the dipole got stuck in a dry phase. Maybe the change was linked to something even bigger. A wobble in Earth's orbit. Earth's orbit isn't perfectly steady either. Over thousands of years, it tilts and shifts in a pattern called the Milankovitch cycles. These change how much sunlight hits different parts of the planet. Sometimes, a few % more sunlight lands in the northern hemisphere. Sometimes, a bit less. Over long periods, that can change the strength of the monsoons and the growth of ice sheets. Around 2200 BCE, the northern hemisphere was getting just a little less summer sunlight. Not enough to be obvious in a single year, but maybe enough to tip the balance when other things were already changing. Solar activity is another piece of the puzzle. The sun doesn't always shine with the same intensity. There are cycles, some about 11 years long, some much longer. When the sun is less active, Earth cools a little. That can nudge wind patterns, weaken monsoons, or change how storms form over the ocean. There's some evidence that solar activity dipped a bit around the time of the big drought. Not a huge drop, but enough to be noticed in things like tree rings and ice cores. Plants grow slower when it's cooler and drier. Trees record that stress as narrow rings. Then there are volcanoes. Big eruptions throw ash and sulfur high into the sky. That reflects sunlight, cools the Earth for a year or two, and can disrupt climate worldwide. We don't have a record of a single super eruption right at 2200 BCE, but there were a few decent-sized blasts in the decades before. These might have pushed the climate system closer to a tipping point. Here's where the idea of tipping points comes in. Some scientists think climate systems can act like a light switch. Push them a little and nothing happens. Push a bit more and suddenly everything flips. A string of smaller events, volcanoes, solar changes, shifts in ocean currents, could all add up. Then, suddenly, the rain stopped. So, to sum up, The big drought that helped bring down these ancient states likely had many causes. A shift in the North Atlantic air pressure, a weaker monsoon, cooler summers in the north, a dip in solar strength, maybe a dusting of volcanic ash. Each on its own might not have been enough, but together they triggered a climate shock. Now, let's think about what this means. It's tempting to look for a single cause, one disaster, one villain. But history is rarely that simple. Climate is a web of connections. Change in one part can ripple out in ways nobody expects. Here's something else. Climate doesn't care about borders. It doesn't know about kingdoms, empires, or cities. When the pattern shifts, everyone gets affected. Farmers can't plan, rulers can't predict. Even the best-run society can't make it rain when the sky refuses. There's a word for this: vulnerability. These early societies built their world around predictable weather. Floods, rains, and seasons were the heartbeat of their systems. When that rhythm changed, the structures they trusted fell apart. But humans are stubborn. As the climate shifted, people tried to adapt. In some places, they built deeper wells. They switched to crops that needed less water. They abandoned some fields and doubled down on others. They moved to higher ground or closer to shrinking rivers. Sometimes these efforts worked for a while. Sometimes they just delayed the inevitable. Here's something interesting. Not every place suffered equally. Some regions, by luck or geography, had more stable water. Mountain valleys or coastlines with steady rain became safe zones. People living there might not even have noticed the drought, at least at first, but most people weren't so lucky. If your city or farm depended on a river that dried up, you were out of options. You could stay and hope for rain, or you could leave, joining thousands of others on the road. Now think about how these changes ripple out. It's not just about weather. When the rains stop, crops fail. When crops fail, food gets scarce. When food is scarce, prices rise. Hungry people get desperate. Governments lose control. But here's the thing. The climate shift didn't just cause famine. It also broke trust. When leaders couldn't fix the problem, their power faded. People stopped believing that the old gods would save them. Some turned to new beliefs or new leaders. Others just left. This is where you start to see migration. People pack up and move. Whole families, even whole villages, head toward places where water still flows. Some find new homes. Others get turned away. The stress builds. This movement of people matters. As refugees arrive in new areas, they bring their skills, their languages, and sometimes their problems. They compete for jobs and land. Sometimes they blend into the new society. Other times they clash with the people already there. Over time, these shifts change the map. Old kingdoms fade and new ones rise. Languages mix, technologies spread. Even religions can change as people adapt to new realities. Here's something to think about. The people living through this didn't know why it was happening. No one could point to a chart of ocean temperatures or a graph of solar activity. They just knew the world was out of balance. The river that always flooded was now a trickle. The rain that fed their crops didn't come. Imagine the confusion, the fear, the stories that must have spread about angry gods, bad omens, or curses. Some probably thought the end of the world was near, but it wasn't the end. It was a shift, a hard one, but not the last the world would see. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The 4,200-year drought is just one example. There have been other climate shocks, some bigger, some smaller. The Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, the Dust Bowl in the United States. Each time, people had to find new ways to survive. What makes the 4,200-year event special is how many societies were affected at once. From Spain to India, From the Sahara to China, people face the same struggle. How to live when the world they knew stopped working. Some survived by changing everything, moving, learning new ways to farm, making new tools. Others didn't make it. Their cities crumbled. Their names were forgotten. There's a lesson here. Climate change isn't just about weather. It's about how people respond. The same event can break one society and leave another mostly untouched. Sometimes the difference is luck. Sometimes it's about flexibility. How willing people are to let go of old ways and try something new. Even today we're not immune. Our world is more connected than ever. We have technology, science, and global trade. But we're still tied to the same planet. The weather still matters. The rain, the oceans, the sun. They're all part of the system we depend on. So when we look back at the past, we're not just seeing old ruins. We're watching people wrestle with forces bigger than themselves. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But they always leave clues. Stories in mud and ice, bones and bricks. That's why scientists dig up ancient lakes and drill into glaciers. They're not just looking for facts. They're listening for echoes, traces of how people long ago faced crisis and change. It makes you wonder, what will people thousands of years from now find when they look back at us? Will they see a society that bent and survived, or one that broke? There's something beautiful about this, how the past and future connect through these old climate mysteries. The people who lived through the 4,200-year drought didn't know they were part of a story that would echo for millennia. They just tried to survive one day at a time. So why did the climate shift? The honest answer is, it's complicated. Winds, water, sunlight, volcanoes, even a wobble in Earth's journey around the sun. All these things came together, tipping the balance. But the real story is how people reacted. Some stayed and adapted. Some moved. Some vanished from history. But new ideas, new cultures, and new ways of life grew out of the chaos. The drought couldn't be stopped. But it didn't erase everyone. Some found a way through. Some built something new from the ruins. And that's the pattern of history. Crisis, collapse, adaptation, renewal. Now the question turns, where did the survivors go? What did they do next? That's where the story heads from here. So the big question is, if these ancient civilizations fell apart, what happened to the people? Did everyone just vanish? Of course not. When cities collapse, people don't just disappear. They move. They look for new places to settle, new ways to survive. The story doesn't end with empty buildings or dried up rivers. It keeps going, just in a different way. Let's start by focusing on the survivors from the region we now call Mesopotamia. After the fall of the empire that once ruled this land, the survivors had to make some hard choices. Their world looked nothing like it did a generation earlier. The grand palaces were abandoned. The canals that once fed their fields were clogged with silt. The old system of government, kings, officials, scribes, was in ruins. But people are creative when they have to be. They didn't just sit in the ruins and wait for rain. Many left the bigger cities and moved into smaller towns. Some travelled north, toward the hills. There the river still had water, and the rains came a bit more often. Others settled near springs or found places where the soil held onto what little water was left. You can see this in the dirt. Archaeologists digging in ancient cities have found thick layers of sand and dust that built up during the worst years. But above those layers, sometimes just a few decades later, there are new signs of life. People moving back in, building houses on top of the old ruins, planting crops, herding animals. It's not just guesswork. There are actual records, written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing pressed into clay tablets. Some of these tablets are lists of people who received food during hard times. Others are receipts for barley or records of animals traded for grain. These little details show us that life went on, even if it was harder and more uncertain. What's really interesting is how the survivors changed the way they lived. The old empire had been all about big cities and huge irrigation projects, long canals, giant walls, massive temples. After the collapse, most people gave up on that scale. They switched to smaller local projects. Instead of one large canal feeding thousands of acres, you'd see lots of short ditches, managed by families or small groups. This made sense. With less water, you couldn't risk everything on one big project. Farming changed too. Some people switched from growing wheat, which needs a lot of water, to barley, which can handle drought better. Others started herding more goats and sheep, animals that can survive on dry grass and scrub. Even the houses changed. They got smaller, simpler. No more grand courtyards or fancy brickwork, just enough to keep out the wind and dust. Religion shifted as well. In the glory days, the main god was often the city's own protector, like Inanna in Uruk or Enlil in Nippur. Temples were huge and busy, but after the collapse, those centres lost their power. People started worshipping more at home or in small local shrines. Sometimes old gods faded and new ones appeared, spirits of wells or hills, protectors of travellers. Trade didn't stop completely, but it shrank. In the old days, merchants brought in tin from the mountains, wood from far-off forests, and luxury goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. After the drought, trade was mostly local. People swapped what they had with nearby neighbours, a goat for a sack of grain, some wool for a pot of honey. But trade routes never stay quiet for long. Within a few generations, new paths were forming. People found new partners. They didn't rebuild the old networks exactly, but they made something different. Over time, these new routes would become the backbone of the later kingdoms. One of the most fascinating things is how language and writing survived. Even as the old government fell, people kept writing. Scribes taught children how to read and write, even if the tablets were now about small debts or family deals instead of royal conquests. In some ways, the collapse helped spread writing further, because it was no longer just for the elite. Ordinary people started using it to keep track of daily life. Now, let's talk about the people who moved far from their old homes. Some survivors travelled hundreds of miles. Families packed up what little they had and went north or east, looking for land that still had water. Some joined villages in the hills. Others became herders, moving with their animals from pasture to pasture, never staying in one place for long. These people didn't just blend in. They brought their skills, how to build bricks, how to make pottery, how to grow crops in tough conditions. Over time, their ideas mixed with the customs of the people they met. You can actually see this in the pottery styles, the shapes of houses, even the kinds of tools found in old villages. Cultures blended, new inventions appeared. Here's something else. The survivors didn't just rebuild what was lost, they created something new. The old empire was gone, but over the next few centuries new cities sprang up. One of the most important was Babylon. It started as a small settlement, not very special. But people brought their stories, their traditions, and their hopes with them. Over time, Babylon grew. It became the centre of a new kingdom, with its own gods, laws, and writing. Babylon didn't just copy the old ways. It took what worked and left the rest behind. The new rulers learned from the mistakes of the past. They built more flexible systems. Instead of putting everything under one king, they used alliances and deals with local leaders. They watched the rivers carefully, rebuilt canals in smarter ways, and learned to store grain for bad years. The story of Babylon is really a story of second chances. The survivors could have given up. They could have lost hope when the old world ended. Instead, they tried things differently. That willingness to adapt made all the difference. Let's look at the small details that make this story real. In the ruins of old villages, archaeologists have found children's toys. Little clay animals, balls, and carved game pieces. Even in hard times, parents wanted their children to play. They cared about giving them something normal, something joyful. Bones tell another part of the story. Studies show that after the collapse, people got shorter on average. That means childhoods were harder, less food, more sickness. But the bones also show healing. People who broke a leg or arm survived and healed, which means families cared for each other. Even when life was rough, community mattered. There are even records of music. In a town called Mari, someone wrote down the notes for a song on a clay tablet. That means music was still important, even when the world was upside down. People found ways to sing, to dance, to remember who they were. So how did people make sense of all this change? Some stories from later times talk about a great flood or a time when the gods were angry. These are probably echoes of the disaster. But over time, new myths grew up. Stories about survival, about wandering to new lands, about starting again. Here's a detail that often gets missed. Not everyone left the old cities. Some people stayed behind, hoping things would improve. They lived among the ruins, planting gardens where courtyards once stood. Some of these stubborn survivors became caretakers of the old temples. They kept the fires burning, waiting for the world to come back to life. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the memory of those places lived on. Later generations would look at the ruins and wonder who built them, what they were like. Even when the old cities were empty, they never truly vanished from the human story. Let's talk about the landscape itself. The land changed too. With fewer people farming, wild plants and animals began to return. Trees grew where fields had been. Herds of wild sheep and deer wandered into abandoned villages. In some ways, nature healed itself while people were struggling to rebuild. But nature can be harsh too. Sometimes new floods would wash away the old ruins. Rivers changed course, making old fields useless, but opening up new land somewhere else. Survivors learned to watch the land closely. They paid attention to signs, the shape of the clouds, the colour of the river, the calls of birds, trying to guess what the next season would bring. Over time, new patterns took hold. People settled into a rhythm that matched the new climate. Maybe the fields were smaller, maybe the harvests weren't as big. But life kept moving forward. Children grew up hearing stories of the old days, but their lives were shaped by the new world. One thing that stands out is how memory worked. Some families kept lists of ancestors, reciting their names before meals or at festivals. These lists might go back 10 or even 20 generations. By remembering the past, people held on to their identity, even as everything changed around them. New leaders rose up too. They weren't always kings in the old sense. Sometimes they were just the best organizer in the village, or the person with the most experience dealing with outsiders. These leaders helped people agree on rules, share water, and defend against raiders. Speaking of raiders, hard times bring out both the best and the worst in people. Some groups turn to banditry, attacking travelers or stealing from nearby farms. Others formed alliances for protection. Over time, these groups could turn into new tribes or even small kingdoms. Here's where it gets philosophical for a moment. When you look at ruins, it's easy to think of loss, what was destroyed, what was forgotten. But the real story is about resilience. The people who lived through these changes didn't have a choice about the drought or the collapse, but they did choose how to respond. They adapted, moved, learned, and kept going. Their choices shaped the world that followed. Without the survivors of those ancient collapses, there would be no Babylon, no later empires, no rich mix of languages and cultures that shaped the Middle East for thousands of years. And here's the thing, this pattern isn't unique. Every big disaster in history leaves behind people who adapt and rebuild. Sometimes what comes after is very different from what came before. But there's always a thread of continuity, a sense that life, in some form, goes on. So, when you think about the survivors of that ancient drought, picture not just the ruins, but the small things. Family sharing bread, children playing, neighbours helping each other dig a new well. Picture people planting seeds, not knowing if rain would come, but hoping anyway. That's the real legacy. Not the fall, but the recovery. And this recovery laid the groundwork for the next chapter in history. The people who survived and rebuilt became the founders of something new. Out of crisis came change. Out of change came opportunity. If you ever visit the ruins of Babylon, or look at photos of ancient bricks worn smooth by centuries of wind, remember, those stones were touched by survivors, people who faced the worst and still found a way forward. And that's the story that echoes through time. Not just collapse, but renewal. Not just loss, but hope. Now, as the dust settled in Mesopotamia, a new city started to rise. Another ancient land was facing its own test. Egypt's story was about to take a very different turn. Let's see what happened there. Egypt. When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably picture pyramids, golden masks, maybe even the Sphinx. But the Egypt of the collapse looked nothing like that. The pyramids were already old. The glory days of the old kingdom were fading. The land that once seemed so stable, so eternal, was thrown into chaos. Here's what happened. Egypt was built around the Nile. Every year the river would flood, spreading rich black mud over the fields. That flood was life itself. It fed the crops, filled the granaries, and kept the whole system running. But during the 4.2 Kiloyear event, the Nile changed. The floods shrank. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Crops failed. Hunger spread. Even the pharaoh, who was supposed to control the universe, couldn't make it rain. Imagine being a farmer back then. You wait for the water, but the river stays low. Your wheat withers. Your children ask for food you can't give them. You start to wonder, did the gods abandon us? Did the king lose his magic? For families up and down the Nile, those years must have felt endless. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt's collapse wasn't sudden. It happened slowly, step by step. The central government lost its grip. In the old days, officials in Memphis and Thebes organised everything. Irrigation, taxes, work crews for the pyramids. Now the system broke down. Local governors, called nomarchs, started to run things their own way. Records from that time are full of complaints. Scribes wrote about grain shortages. Priests begged for offerings to keep the temples open. Common people grumbled about taxes they couldn't pay. Some even wrote letters blaming the government for letting things fall apart. A whole genre of Egyptian writing called laments appeared. These are poems and stories describing a world turned upside down. They talk about famine, lawlessness, and families forced to eat strange foods just to survive. But, and this is important, the story doesn't stop there. Egypt didn't vanish. Egypt came back. Let's look at how survival played out along the Nile. Not everyone suffered the same way. Some regions had better luck. The delta, where the river spreads out before meeting the sea, often kept some water even in dry years. People there did little better. Other places, like the Fayum oasis, had lakes and wetlands to fall back on. Some families moved to these safer places. Others left their farms and tried to make it in the towns. Cities like Heracleopolis and Thebes saw their populations swell as refugees arrived, desperate for food and work. You can imagine how tense those towns got. Too many mouths to feed, not enough grain. Old rules started to break down, but at the same time, people got creative. When the floods failed, some built new irrigation ditches to squeeze every drop from the river. Others switched crops, planting barley or lentils that needed less water. Herding animals became more important. Goats could survive where cows and pigs could not. You can even track these changes in the trash. Archaeologists digging through old rubbish heaps found more goat and sheep bones, fewer cattle. Fish bones appear in places where people didn't eat much fish before. When times get tough, diets change. Some families made their living in new ways. Small workshops appeared making pottery, baskets and simple tools. Trade with neighbours picked up. People swapped what they had for what they needed. Maybe a pot of honey for a bundle of reeds. Maybe a jar of beer for a few loaves of bread. But life wasn't just about getting by. Even in the worst years, Egyptians clung to their traditions. They kept building tombs, though they were smaller and simpler than before. They wrote prayers and spells to protect themselves in this world and the next. The art from this period often shows people hoping for a better time, a return of good floods, a restoration of order. Religion, which was always a big deal in Egypt, became even more personal. With the big temples running out of offerings, families started making their own shrines at home. Small clay statues of gods and goddesses turn up everywhere. People left offerings of bread, beer, or flowers, hoping to win a little favour. Written records from this time are full of anxiety. One famous document is called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It's basically a long complaint letter. It says things like, "The river is blood and the land is in chaos." It talks about the poor becoming rich, the rich becoming poor, and servants taking over the houses of their masters. It's hard to know how much is true and how much is exaggeration, but it shows how people felt, like their world had flipped upside down. Now, let's get specific. What happened to the pharaohs? During the drought, the old royal family lost control. Egypt split in two. In the north, a new line of kings set up in Heracleopolis. In the south, rulers in Thebes claimed to be the real pharaohs. For nearly 200 years, Egypt was divided. Sometimes the two sides fought. Sometimes they tried to negotiate. But there was no single ruler over the whole country. This was called the First Intermediate Period. It lasted from about 2181 to 2055 BCE. That's about 125 years, but the exact dates are fuzzy. This wasn't a dark age in the sense of total collapse. People still built houses, farmed fields, and buried their dead. But it was a time of uncertainty. No more huge monuments, no more all-powerful kings, just local leaders, each trying to keep things working in their own corner. Here's where it gets interesting. While the centre was weak, the provinces got strong. Local families rose to power. Some became little dynasties, passing down titles from father to son. These local leaders built small tombs decorated with scenes of daily life. Fishing, farming, feasting. For the first time, regular people, not just royals, show up in art and writing. This shift had a big impact. It made Egypt less top-heavy. Power no longer flowed from a single spot. Instead, it was spread out. When things finally improved, this helped Egypt bounce back even stronger. What about ordinary people? Most lived in mud brick houses along the Nile. During the drought, many of these homes were abandoned. You can spot the layers in the dirt. Houses built, then left to crumble, then rebuilt again when the floods returned. Evidence from cemeteries shows that people were shorter and had more signs of stress. Bad teeth, broken bones, signs of hunger. Life was hard, but families stuck together. Graves often show people buried with simple jewellery or small pots, tokens of love or hope. Conflict was common. Bandits roamed the countryside, Some villages built walls or dug ditches for protection. Stories from the time tell of raids, kidnappings, and revenge. But there were also stories of kindness, neighbours sharing food, strangers offering shelter. Trade changed too. With the government weak, long-distance routes broke down. No more gold from Nubia or cedar wood from Lebanon. People turned inward. Local trade, grain for fish, baskets for bread, kept things going. Yet, even in tough times, Egypt held on to its identity. People still called themselves children of the Nile. They still believed in Mayat, the idea of balance and order. Even when everything felt upside down, that belief stayed strong. Here's a detail I find fascinating. Art from this time started to change. Earlier everything was stiff, formal, perfect. Now you see more relaxed poses, more emotion, scenes of farm life, families eating together, even jokes, like a monkey stealing fruit. It's like people wanted to focus on the basics, the things that mattered most. Some things got lost, craft skills declined, pottery got thicker and clumsier, some writing styles disappeared for a while, but other traditions like music and storytelling survived at home and in small villages. People found new ways to keep their culture alive. After about 100 years, things slowly improved. The Nile's floods came back. Harvests got better. The rulers in Thebes grew stronger. Eventually a king named Mentuhotep II managed to reunite Egypt. He conquered the north, brought the country back together, and started what we now call the Middle Kingdom. This was a turning point. The new kings learned from the mistakes of the past. They made government more flexible. They worked with local leaders instead of trying to control everything from one city. They also reformed taxes, rebuilt temples, and restarted long-distance trade. The Middle Kingdom wasn't just a return to the old ways, it was a time of new ideas. Literature flourished. Some of Egypt's most famous stories, like the Tale of Sinuhe, were written then. Art became more natural. Tombs got bigger again, but they were built in new places, not just near the old pyramids. The lessons from the collapse shaped everything. Leaders understood the power of local communities. Farmers knew not to trust the floods completely. They stored more grain, built extra canals, and watched the river closely. The old image of the all-powerful pharaoh faded a bit. Now, rulers had to prove they could keep chaos away. You can see this in their titles. Earlier kings called themselves Lords of the Two Lands and Son of Ra. The new kings added more practical names, like Bringer of Peace or Restorer of Order. It's as if they wanted everyone to remember that survival depended on more than just magic or birthright. There's another interesting shift. Before the collapse, only kings and nobles expected a good afterlife. Regular people just hoped for a simple burial. But during and after the hard years, the idea of the afterlife became more democratic. More people included spells in their graves. More believed they could join Osiris, the god of the dead, if they lived a good life. It's like hope broke through even during the darkest times. Let's talk about numbers. During the crisis, Egypt's population dropped. Some estimates say by as much as 1/3. That means thousands of families vanished or moved away. But over the next 2 centuries, the numbers climbed again. New villages appeared, old towns filled up, the land healed, and so did the people. The memory of those years didn't fade. Later kings told stories of chaos and recovery. They built temples to show off their power, but they also carved warnings, reminders of what happens when order fails. What's the big lesson here? Egypt's collapse wasn't just about suffering. It was about adaptation. Families tried new crops, new jobs, new ways of worship. Local leaders learned to work together. When the floods finally returned, the country was ready to come back stronger. There's something beautiful about that. Survival isn't always about heroes. It's about everyday choices, planting barley instead of wheat, sharing bread, helping a neighbour. Over time, those small acts built the road back to greatness. Egypt's story proves that even the oldest, most powerful systems can break, but it also shows that people can recover. They can find new ways to live, new ways to hope. So, while Mesopotamia was rebuilding in its own way, Egypt was doing the same, just differently. The shape of the land, the habits of the people, even the floods of the Nile all played a part. But the heart of it was always the same. Ordinary people refusing to give up. And as Egypt rose again, so did its neighbours. Babylon would soon become a new centre of power, but not every civilization came back in the same way, because over to the east, the people of the Indus Valley faced a different challenge, and their answer to collapse would be something completely new. Let's shift our focus east. Picture the vast plains and river valleys that stretch out beneath the Himalayas. You're looking at a place that thousands of years ago was dotted with brick cities, wide streets, grids so straight they look modern. There were wells on every block, bathhouses for cleaning up. Some cities even had what looks like water towers, tall brick tanks, probably for storing clean water. It all feels strangely familiar, even though it's ancient. But then, something started to go wrong. The big cities started to empty out, not overnight. There was no sudden disaster, no record of fires or mass burials, no stories of battles or floods etched in stone. Instead, people simply left. Brick by brick, house by house, the crowds thinned. The silence must have grown slowly, like a fog rolling in. Shops closed, workshops faded. The noise of carts and sellers, kids and animals faded out. Why did people leave? The most likely answer is simple. The rivers changed. The main river was called the Gagahakra. Today it's mostly dry. Back then it was huge. Some scientists think it might even be the same as the ancient Saraswati, a river written about in India's oldest stories. This river was the heart of the civilization. But over time, the monsoon failed. Less rain fell each year. The river shrank, split, and sometimes vanished completely. Without water, farming became impossible. Now think about what this would feel like. Imagine you're a farmer in a village outside one of those big cities. For years you follow the old rhythm, wait for the rains, plant your seeds, watch the river rise. But the rains come late. Then, not at all. The riverbed starts to crack. Your fields turn dusty brown. One year your harvest is half what it should be. Next year there's almost nothing. You try digging deeper wells, but the water is salty. You wait for the weather to turn back, but it doesn't. You talk to your neighbours. Everyone's in the same boat. Some people give up and leave. They pack what they can carry. Maybe a bundle of wheat, a few clay pots, a family idol. They follow the river downstream, hoping to find a place where the water still flows. Others head east, toward the Ganges plain. It's wetter there, but it's also crowded and unknown. Still, it's better than starving where you are. This wasn't a single wave of refugees. It happened over generations. Grandparents left, then their children, then their grandchildren. The movement was slow, almost invisible from the outside. But if you could speed up time, you'd see entire regions emptying out. Cities that once held tens of thousands became ghost towns. The bricks stayed, but the people were gone. What's strange is how calm this collapse looks. There's almost no evidence of warfare, no skeletons with signs of battle wounds. Forts and city walls weren't strengthened. Archaeologists haven't found burned layers that would mean fire or fighting. Instead, houses were just left behind. Sometimes, pottery was left unfinished. Tools were dropped, never picked up again. It's like people simply walked away. Here's another thing that stands out. The famous cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, started to shrink. But in the countryside, new villages popped up. These were smaller, usually without the fancy brickwork or public baths. People who left the cities didn't disappear. They scattered across the land. They set up new farms near smaller streams or near springs that hadn't dried up. Life kept going, just in a simpler way. And the cities themselves changed. Towards the end, the brick buildings weren't made as well. People stopped using the classic 4 to 2 to 1 brick ratio. Some houses were built with mud instead of fired brick. Big public wells got filled in and turned into trash pits. The fancy drains and sewers clogged up. It's like people were doing the best they could with less. Less water, less trade, fewer workers. Trade was another casualty. For centuries, these people traded with faraway places. Beads from the Indus show up in Mesopotamia, copper from Oman, shells from the coast. But as the climate dried, long journeys became too risky. Merchants stopped coming. The flow of goods slowed, then stopped. People had to rely on what they could make or grow themselves. Writing faded too. Those little carved seals, covered in symbols nobody can read, stop appearing in the last layers of the cities. Maybe the scribes left. Maybe there wasn't enough surplus to support specialists like writers or traders. Or maybe the meaning of the script was lost as people scattered to new places. But daily life went on, in new forms. People learned to make do with local things. Pottery styles changed, less fancy, more practical. Tools got simpler. Jewellery became rare. But people still cooked, cleaned, raised animals, and buried their dead. Graves from this time are small, often with just a pot or two as a gift. Not much, but something. What about religion? This is tricky. We don't have their stories, but we do have their statues and shrines. Early on, there were lots of small clay figures, animals, goddesses, maybe gods. Some show people sitting cross-legged, maybe meditating. After the city's emptied, these figures still show up, but less often. It looks like big public ceremonies faded. Instead, families kept their own little traditions at home. There's also a shift in where people lived. Before, everyone crowded near the main rivers. After the drought, people moved east toward the wetter plains. This set the stage for the next big chapter in Indian history, the rise of new cultures along the Ganges. Some of the oldest villages in modern India and Bangladesh go back to this time. It's a sign that people didn't give up. They just moved and adapted. Let's talk numbers for a second. At its peak, the civilization covered about 1 million square kilometers. That's bigger than Texas and California combined. At least 5 million people lived there. By the end, most of the big cities had lost 90% of their population. Some cities were completely abandoned. But in the east, new settlements grew. If you look at the map, it's like the population just slid sideways following the water. Farming changed too. Earlier, people grew wheat and barley, good for dry weather. When the rains failed, these crops struggled. So people started planting rice, which needs more water but can grow in wetter places. Rice farming spread eastward, following the monsoon. This shift would shape Indian agriculture for thousands of years. Animal bones tell their own story. In the early days, cattle were king. Huge herds roamed the plains. But as pastures dried up, herders switched to goats and sheep, animals that can survive on dry scrub. Fish bones get rarer in the last layers, probably because the rivers shrank and fish became scarce. Even the way people built their houses changed. Early houses had thick walls, flat roofs, and central courtyards. Later, homes became smaller, with thinner walls, maybe because people had less to spend, or because families were smaller. Some houses were built right on top of old ones, layer after layer, each a little poorer than the last. There's almost no sign of kings or armies, no royal palaces, no big tombs full of treasure. Power seems to have been spread out, Maybe that's why the end wasn't violent. Without a king to defend, nobody fought to the death for the city walls. When things got bad, people just left. Tools got simpler, but they didn't vanish. Farmers kept using ploughs and sickles. Potters kept turning clay. Weavers made cloth. Life kept going, just without the big extras. No more fancy jewellery, no more imported copper, no more long-distance trade. You might wonder, what happened to the kids? Archaeologists found small toys in the ruins, little carts with wheels, animal figurines, spinning tops. Even as the cities faded, children played. Families tried to keep things normal. That's a detail I find comforting. Now, here's something interesting. The script, the writing system, vanished. For hundreds of years, people used those mysterious symbols. Then suddenly, nobody wrote them anymore. No one knows why. Maybe the teachers left. Maybe the new villages didn't need scribes. Or maybe the spoken language changed so much that the script didn't fit anymore. That's a mystery we haven't solved. All this movement, people leaving cities, building new villages, switching crops, left its mark. Later cultures in India remember a migration eastward. Some of the oldest stories in Hinduism talk about a lost river, the Saraswati, and people moving toward the Ganges. Maybe these are echoes of real migrations, remembered for thousands of years. What about disease? There's not much evidence for plagues or epidemics. Most skeletons from this time look healthy, though a bit shorter and thinner than before. That fits with hard times. Less food, more work, but no signs of mass illness. As for violence, again, there's little sign. A few skeletons show broken bones, maybe from accidents or fights, but nothing on the scale of war. This was a quiet end, not a bloody one. So what does this tell us about survival? When faced with disaster, these people didn't build walls or fight wars. They moved, they adapted their farms, they changed what they ate, how they built, and where they lived. Instead of clinging to the old ways, they let go and tried something new. There's something beautiful about this. It's not flashy. There are no heroes in shining armour, just millions of regular people doing their best to get by. Picking up, moving on, keeping their families safe. Over time, their choices shaped the next chapter of history. The memory of the cities never quite faded. Later cultures built on the old ruins. Some villages today sit right on top of ancient streets. Farmers plough up old bricks and beads, sometimes not even knowing how old they are. The echo of the lost civilization is still there, under the dust. And yet, life went on. New languages appeared. New gods were worshipped. Farming changed forever. But the spirit of adaptation, of doing what it takes to survive, remained. When you look at the big picture, it's easy to focus on the collapse, the empty cities, the lost writing, the end of trade. But underneath all that was a quiet success story. People found ways to keep going, even as everything shifted around them. That's the lesson here. Survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just steady. It's moving to where the water still flows. It's planting rice instead of wheat. It's building a house with whatever you have. It's telling your kids stories to help them feel safe. Even as the world changes, the old cities became legends. The riverbeds dried up. But the people survived. They carried their memories, their skills, and their hopes into new lands. They started again. And in time, new cultures, new kingdoms, and new stories would rise in the east. This transformation reshaped the geography of South Asia. The old centres faded, but the life of the region continued, moulded by the choices of ordinary people. And that's how one of the world's greatest civilizations didn't end with fire or war, but with a quiet, determined search for a new beginning. The collapse wasn't really the end. It was the start of something different. It set the stage for everything that came after. Next, let's think about what these ancient shifts actually mean for us, here and now. Because the way those survivors adapted shaped not just their world, but ours too. Let's step back for a moment and really look at what happened, not just to these ancient cities, but to the whole idea of civilization itself. When you hear about three giant cultures falling apart around the same time, it's natural to wonder, was this just bad luck, or is there something deeper going on? Why do big societies sometimes fall to pieces even when, from the outside, they seem so strong? This is the warning hidden in their story. Not a warning in the sense of a scary prophecy, but more like a lesson, quietly sitting in the ruins. Civilizations aren't as permanent as they look. Even the most organized, wealthy and powerful societies can face problems they can't control. Sometimes it's not about wars or enemies. Sometimes it's the land itself that shifts under their feet. So why does this matter? Because we often think of progress as a straight line. We imagine that once people figure out writing, cities and farming, they're set. But that's not how history works. The 4,200-year event with its slow, grinding drought shows how fragile the whole system can be. Even today, with all our technology, we're not separate from nature. We still rely on regular seasons, steady rivers, predictable weather. The people back then did too. They built their worlds around these things. When those patterns broke, so did their worlds. It's easy now to look back and ask, why didn't they just prepare better? But think about it. They did prepare as best as they could. They built canals, stored grain, dug wells, traded for food when they could. But some changes are bigger than any plan. If the rain stops for a few years, you tighten your belt. If it stops for 100 years, that's a different story. Let's break it down. Why do big societies sometimes fail, even when the people are smart and hard-working? Historians and scientists have argued about this for years. There isn't one answer, but there are a few main ideas. First, there's the idea of complexity. When things are going well, societies get bigger and more complicated. They build new cities, invent new tools, set up trade routes, create jobs for scribes and priests. That complexity makes life better, but it also makes the system harder to manage. If something big goes wrong, like a long drought or a failed harvest, suddenly all that complexity is a weakness. It takes a lot to keep everything running. If a key part breaks, the rest can fall apart quickly. Think of it like a huge machine. When everything's working, it's amazing. But if one gear slips, the whole thing can grind to a halt. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the system depended on a network of canals and government officials to manage water. When the rivers dried up, the canals clogged, and the officials lost power. Without water, the fields failed. Without food, the cities couldn't survive. The machine stopped. Another big idea is resilience. Some societies bounce back from disasters better than others. Why? It often comes down to flexibility. Can people change how they live, what they eat, where they work? In Egypt, when the Nile shrank, some people left the hardest hit areas and moved south. Others might have tried different crops or found work outside farming. But the old system, where the pharaoh was at the top and the river gave life to everyone, wasn't built for change. When the river failed, the old way of doing things couldn't adapt fast enough. Now, let's talk about dependence on the environment. These ancient cultures were deeply tied to their land. The rivers weren't just part of life, they were life. When the rain patterns changed, or when a river shifted, it wasn't just a bad season, it was a total reset. No backup plan, no imports from halfway across the globe like we have now. But here's what's fascinating. Sometimes disasters bring people together. Sometimes they tear them apart. In the ancient world, you see both. There's evidence that some groups formed tighter communities, helping each other out. In other places, people scattered, looking for better land or safer lives. It's not easy to predict which will happen. It depends on trust, on leadership, on luck, and on timing. The warning, if you want to call it that, is about the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket. When a society depends on one river, or one crop, or one narrow way of life, it's vulnerable. If that thing fails, everything else can fall apart. The Akkadian Empire depended on a careful balance of water, food, and trade. The Indus cities needed strong rivers and steady rains. When those things changed, so did history. Now, let's think about what this means for us today. We live in a world that feels much more secure. We have global trade, technology, science. But we're not so different from those ancient people. We still build our lives around what the land gives us. We still need stable weather, healthy soil, clean water. When those things shift, even the strongest systems can feel the strain. You might hear people talk about tipping points or collapse in the news. These are big, scary words. But if you look at ancient history, collapse isn't always sudden or total. Sometimes it's slow. People move away, change what they do, start over somewhere else. What looks like the end from far away is really just a shift. A long, messy change, not a simple disaster. One of the biggest myths about ancient collapse is that it's always violent. That's not true. Sometimes, as we've seen, people leave quietly, find new homes, and build new cultures. The ruins stay behind, but life continues somewhere else. That's a kind of survival too. So why do we care about these warnings from the past? Because they remind us that nothing lasts forever, not even the biggest cities or the richest empires. Change is normal. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes fast, but it always comes. The trick is to be ready to change with it, instead of fighting the world as it shifts. Let's look at another angle: memory. How do later generations remember these collapses? Sometimes they don't. The stories get lost. Other times the memories are passed down as legends, tales of lost rivers, vanished cities, ancient kings. These stories can help people make sense of change. They can also warn future generations. Don't forget what happened when the river dried up. Don't put all your hope in one harvest or one leader. But memory can also fade. After a few generations, people might not remember why their ancestors left, only that they did. The lessons can be lost, buried under new problems and new ways of life. There's another layer to this warning. It's about pride. When things are going well, people tend to believe their way of life will last forever. The old kings of Mesopotamia wrote their victories on stone tablets, certain their cities would never fall. Egyptian pharaohs built tombs to last for eternity. The Indus people made cities so carefully planned, you'd think they expected them to stand forever. But in the end, all these cultures faced things they couldn't control. It's easy to see this as a story about failure, but I think it's more complicated. These people built amazing things. They invented writing, agriculture, city planning, and trade networks that stretched across continents. Even when their worlds changed, the skills and ideas they developed didn't vanish. They spread, mixed, and turned into something new. So maybe the real warning isn't about collapse, but about what comes after. The end of a city doesn't mean the end of its people or its ideas. Sometimes, a society's greatest gift is how it adapts, not how it stands still. Let's go deeper into the idea of adaptation. What helps a society survive big challenges? Some researchers say it's diversity, having lots of different ways to live, to grow food, to solve problems. If everyone does the same thing, a single disaster can wipe out the whole system. But if people try new crops, new jobs, new tools. Some of those will survive. In the ancient world, you see this pattern. After the big cities faded, new villages sprang up in different places. People planted different seeds, raised different animals, built different kinds of houses. They didn't copy the old ways exactly. Instead, they mixed old knowledge with new ideas. Over time, these changes created the foundations for later cultures. There's a kind of humility in this. No one can control the weather, or the floods, or the long-term shift of the earth. The only thing people really control is how they respond. Sometimes the best thing to do isn't to build bigger walls, but to move, to try something new, to keep going. Here's another interesting idea. Some scientists study early warning signs in complex systems. They look for clues that a system is getting too fragile. For example, in nature, sometimes you see big swings, floods, droughts, wildfires, right before a major shift. In societies, you might see more riots, more migration, more people leaving cities. These aren't the cause of collapse, but they're signs that the old way is under stress. In the ancient stories, you can sometimes spot these warnings. Records from Egypt talk about years with low floods, grain shortages, and growing unrest. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia mention people leaving their homes, fields going untended, and trade breaking down. Even the silence in the record, the sudden stop in writing or building, can be a kind of warning. But here's the hard part. Living through this kind of change is tough. It's easy for us to look back and see the pattern, because we know how the story ends. People living at the time didn't have that comfort. They just knew things were getting harder, year after year. So, what's the lesson for us? Maybe it's to pay attention to the signs, both big and small. Maybe it's to keep our systems flexible and not count on any one thing to save us. Maybe the real strength of a society is how well it can adapt when everything changes. Sometimes, I wonder what those ancient people would think if they could see us now. Would they be surprised at how much we rely on technology, or how far our trade networks stretch? Or would they just recognize the same old patterns? People building, hoping, adapting, and sometimes moving on when they have to? There's something comforting about that. We're part of a long story, one that goes back thousands of years. The same things that challenged our ancestors, drought, shifting rivers, changing weather, still shape our lives today. But so does the ability to adapt, to build new things out of the ruins of the old. Let's not forget, not every collapse is the end. Sometimes it's a turning point. The fall of one city can lead to the growth of another. Old knowledge mixes with new, and something different grows in its place. So, if there's a warning in these ancient stories, maybe it's just this. Nothing is guaranteed. Even the strongest system can be shaken by forces outside its control. But also, survival isn't about never falling. It's about getting up again, trying something new, and carrying forward what matters most. You might be wondering, can we really learn from people who lived so long ago in such a different world? I think we can. Not because their answers were perfect, but because they faced the same basic challenge we do. How to keep going when everything changes. Their stories remind us to stay humble, to pay attention, and to be ready for the unexpected. And at the same time, there's hope in these stories. Even after the worst disasters, people found ways to start again. They didn't have all the answers, but they kept moving forward. That's something we can all hold on to. As you drift towards sleep, let's return to where we started. 4,200 years ago when the rain stopped. So, after looking at how these three ancient cultures faced disaster, what do we really learn? Let's take a step back and ask, what does the story of these collapses actually tell us about people, about change, and about what it means to build something that lasts? First, It's easy to focus on the dramatic parts. Cities emptying, rivers drying up, fields turning to dust. But when you zoom out, the bigger story is about how people face the unknown. They never had all the answers. They didn't know how long the drought would last or if the rains would ever return. But they still had to wake up every day and make choices. Stay or go. Try to fix what's broken, or start fresh somewhere else. These are questions people still face today, just in different forms. Let's look at how ancient people dealt with uncertainty. They didn't just wait around. They built granaries to store food, hoping it would be enough for the lean years. They dug new wells, looking for water underground when the rivers failed. Some tried to make deals with neighbours, trading for grain or cattle. Others took a risk and moved to new lands, not knowing what they'd find. None of these moves were perfect. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. But the point is, people kept trying. They didn't give up. Now, you might wonder, was there ever a way for them to see disaster coming? Could they have read the signs? In some ways, yes. Ancient records talk about strange weather, bad harvests, and unhappy crowds. Priests and scribes sometimes warned the king about trouble, signs in the sky, or the river not rising. But it's one thing to notice a problem. It's another thing to believe it's the start of something huge. Most people probably thought things would bounce back like they always had before. That's something we still struggle with. How do you know when a bad year is just a normal bump and when it's the start of a bigger crisis? It's not easy. Even today, with weather forecasts and satellites, we can miss the signs. Maybe that's part of being human. We hope for the best, even when there are warning lights flashing. Let's talk about loss. Ancient records sometimes mention hunger, fear, and leaders who lost control. But they rarely talk about how it felt to leave home, or to see your city fall apart. Those stories are mostly silent now, but we can guess. Leaving behind a house your family built or a field you planted every year must have been hard. It meant letting go of everything familiar. That's never easy. But loss isn't the only thing that comes from collapse. There's also creativity. When people are forced to move, they don't just carry their troubles. They bring their skills, their beliefs, their ways of making things. When those groups settle somewhere new, old and new ideas mix. This is how traditions spread, change, and sometimes become something totally different. For example, after the big drought, some people who left the big cities brought their knowledge of writing, farming, and building to new places. Maybe they showed others how to make bricks, or how to store grain for dry years. Maybe they learned new tricks from the people they met. Over generations, these mixes can spark new inventions, new stories, and even new languages. This is a pattern you see all over history. When big changes happen, things don't just end, they transform. The fall of one city can lead to the rise of another. The skills and stories that survive get passed down, changed a little each time, until they turn into something new. Let's shift and look at what makes a society last. Is it the size of the city, the strength of its walls, its leaders, or is it something else? When you look at these ancient collapses, you start to see that survival often depends on flexibility, not just strength. The cities that survived the longest weren't always the biggest or richest. Sometimes they were the ones that could change when they needed to, trying new crops, trading with new partners, or welcoming strangers with new ideas. There's a lesson here for anyone who thinks bigger is always better. Sometimes being too big makes it hard to turn when trouble comes. Small villages or groups that can move quickly sometimes have an advantage. They can adapt. They can change directions. They don't have to drag a giant system with them. It's kind of like turning a huge ship versus a small boat. The ship can carry more, but once it starts turning, it takes a long time. The little boat can dodge trouble faster. even if it can't hold as much. So looking at these stories, maybe the real strength isn't just in building something huge, it's in staying open to change, in being willing to let go of old ways when they stop working, and in keeping the door open to new ideas. Another thing that stands out is the role of memory. How do we remember a collapse or a disaster? Sometimes the story gets passed down as a warning. Sometimes it's forgotten, buried under new stories. What's interesting is that even when the details fade, the feeling stays. The sense that things can change quickly, that nothing lasts forever. Some legends talk about lost cities, sunken lands, or golden ages that ended in disaster. Maybe they're echoes of real events, like the stories of rivers that stopped flowing, or lands that turned to desert. These stories can be a way of making sense of what happened, and a way to warn people not to take good times for granted. But stories can also comfort us. They remind us that hard times have happened before, and people found a way through. Even if everything changes, life goes on, new stories begin. Let's not forget about the natural world. One of the biggest lessons from these collapses is that people aren't separate from nature. No matter how clever we get, we still depend on things like water, soil, and weather. When those things change, we have to change too. That doesn't mean we're powerless. Ancient people didn't have the tools we do now, but they still tried to shape their world, digging canals, planting new crops, building walls. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the drive to keep going, to try again, is part of what makes people so interesting. Now think about today. We have science, technology, and ways to talk to people all over the planet. But we also face big questions about the future, about water, food, weather, and how to live when things shift. Maybe the most useful thing we can learn from the past is the value of staying flexible, of working together, and of not putting all our hope in one answer. Here's something else to consider. Every time people rebuilt after disaster, they had a choice: to copy the old ways or to try something new. Sometimes fear of change kept things stuck. Other times, a new idea made all the difference. It's tempting to hold tight to what worked before, but sometimes the only way forward is to let go, even if it feels risky. This isn't just a lesson for ancient times. It's true for people, families, even whole countries today. When you face a problem that's bigger than anything you've seen, sometimes the best answer is to look for something you haven't tried yet. Finally, let's talk about hope. The story of these collapses isn't just about endings, it's about new beginnings too. Even after the worst droughts, the harshest years, people found ways to survive. They moved, they rebuilt, they learned. Sometimes, what grew out of disaster was stronger, wiser, or simply different. If you ever feel like the world is changing too fast or that things are falling apart, remember, change is part of the story. It always has been. The key isn't to avoid change, but to face it with open eyes and a willingness to adapt. The ruins left behind by ancient cultures aren't just reminders of what was lost. They're also proof that people kept trying, even when things looked hopeless. Every broken wall, every silent street is part of a bigger story, one of survival, of trying new things, and of never giving up. So as you close your eyes tonight, maybe think of those distant cities and the people who once called them home. They faced challenges we can barely imagine, but they also dreamed, planned, and hoped for a better future. Their story is our story, in a way. We keep going, we keep adapting, and we keep passing down the lessons, even if we don't always realize it. Change is the only constant. That's just how life works. And somehow, through all the ups and downs, people find a way. They always have. They always will.